Hi, and thank you for joining us for Phosphorus Science Now. I'm Matt Schultz from the Sustainable Phosphorus Alliance, and we're going to be discussing today a paper that recently came out in Science of the Total Environment. The title of the paper is Meta-Analysis of Non-Reactive Phosphorus in Water, Wastewater, and Sludge, and Strategies to Convert It for Enhanced Phosphorus Removal and Recovery. We're joined today by its lead author, Dr. Kaushik Venkiteshwaran, and he is a postdoctoral researcher at the Department of Civil Construction and Environmental Engineering at Marquette University. There, he specializes in environmental biotechnology, and his research focuses on optimizing energy and nutrient recovery from wastewater. So welcome, Kaushik, and thanks for joining us for Phosphorus Science Now. I understand you had some help with this paper, as all scientists do, and was hoping you could introduce us to your co-authors.
Yes, thank you, Matt, for first of all inviting me for this. And so this paper was co-authored by Dr. Patrick McNamara, and Dr. Brooke Mayer. Dr. Brooke Mayer serves as the associate professor at the Department of Civil Construction and Environmental Engineering at Marquette University. And Dr. McNamara is currently the assistant professor in the same department. And both Dr. McNamara and Dr. Mayer and myself, our research focuses on looking at physical chemical processes for water wastewater treatment. And as related to phosphorus, we are constantly trying to investigate opportunities to improve the removal and recovery of phosphorus. So this paper that we worked on for the last 1 year, we actually focused on better management, better phosphorus management, with a particular emphasis on looking at the fractions of phosphorus.
So, yeah, that's great. And Brooke has actually given a Phosphorus Science Now talk that people can listen to just recently. She's done some great work here. And maybe you could explain to us a little bit about those pools of phosphorus and specifically what you mean by non-reactive phosphorus.
Sure. So as you can see in this flow chart, so this flow chart has been modified from the standard methods of water wastewater analysis. So in this, we have divided the total phosphorus into two main fractions, the reactive and the non-reactive phosphorus. Now, generally in phosphorus, if you go through the standard methods, etc., they divide the phosphorus into three main fractions, which is the orthophosphate, which is the same as the reactive phosphorus. And then they divide it into what's called the acid hydrolyzable phosphorus fractions, which is generally also known as the polyphosphates. And finally, you have the organic phosphorus fractions. So the reactive phosphorus is generally referred to the phosphorus which are the orthophosphate form. So if I just move on to the next slide, and here in this table on the top left, on the top, you have the SRP, which stands for the soluble reactive phosphorus. And they generally come in four forms, and basically they are the same orthophosphate form with a proton attached to it, which is not a strong bonding on itself. Then you have what we refer to as the soluble non-reactive form. Now, the reactive part in these names comes from the fact that orthophosphate reacts with molybdenate. Now, this reaction is very commonly used in detection of phosphate in water. So one of the most common techniques is the ascorbic acid method, which also relies on this complex formed between the orthophosphate and the molybdenate compound. So generally, all the phosphorus which reacts with molybdenate is known as the reactive phosphorus, and all those don't, known as the non-reactive phosphorus.
Okay.
Now, also, as it so happened that the reactive phosphorus form is also the form which precipitates easily because it's both chemically, biologically more active and reactive than the non-reactive forms. So generally, when we try to precipitate out a phosphorus fraction in water using calcium, iron, or struvite, it's usually the orthophosphate form which precipitates out immediately. And hence, it's always beneficial to have most of the phosphorus you want to recover in that orthophosphate form in order to ensure that you're removing most of the phosphorus from the water. At the same time, you can also recover it and make it into a better product.
That's great. And I think you did a great job in this paper of breaking these things down chemically, which was really nice. And also, I think on your next slide, you get into sort of how this phosphorus partitions at different points of the phosphorus, the value chain.
Yeah. So generally, we tried to look at a lot of different streams. So we wanted to look at water, wastewater, and also basically sludge or agriculture residues. Unfortunately, though, one of the reasons we wanted to write this review is because there is not much information on these fractions. So there's a lot of work which has been done to improve or talk about better phosphorus management. We have looked into diffuse versus point source. We have looked at food, the flow of phosphorus in food systems, like this flow chart, which has been modified from Cordell and White paper. And it actually shows the phosphorus flows in the global food system. But unfortunately, the fractions of phosphorus is not necessarily discussed. Mostly it's always in total phosphorus or in soluble reactive or the orthophosphate form, which is usually discussed. So what we wanted to do here is to emphasize the importance of these other fractions and state that not all phosphorus is created equal. So in this flow chart here, you can see the flow of phosphorus coming from the phosphate rocks, going all the way to human consumption and then being released into our fresh and coastal waters. So this is where most Cordell and White's paper stopped in this flowchart. However, we went deeper and tried to find generally what are the fractions of phosphorus in these runoffs. And from our review, we found that the total P can range anywhere from 4 to 20 milligrams per liter for sewage. However, more than half of it can be the non-reactive phosphorus forms. So if that's the scenario, then we don't have any particular technology available right now to get that reactive or non-reactive phosphorus forms and readily recover it.
So can I clarify something on this, Kaushik? So when you say 50 to 75% is soluble reactive phosphorus, that doesn't necessarily mean that the rest is non-reactive phosphorus, right? Because some of that could be particulate as well.
Yes, so some of this can be particulate reactive phosphorus as well. Yes.
Okay.
So the one thing we wanted to emphasize as well is the particulate reactive phosphorus. Unfortunately, even though it can be removed because now it's in a solid form and you can use conventional filtration techniques, etc., to remove them. However, because they are in particulate form, reusability and recoverability as a single pure product would be difficult because those particulate phosphorus would be in an iron, calcium, magnesium, all sorts of forms. So it's always better to, in terms of recovery, it's always better to have the SRP form, which you can then control and make it into a better product as a recovered product.
Sure, that makes sense. And then you did a pretty large survey then of different systems.
Yes, so one of the main objectives, apart from highlighting the fractions of phosphorus, is to provide a quantitative assessment of the presence of these non-reactive phosphorus species in water, wastewater, and sludge matrices. Now, we looked at a lot of review articles in which they have mentioned these fractions, but generally speaking, as I mentioned earlier, it's usually the soluble reactive phosphorus and the total phosphorus information which is available. In this plot over here on the y-axis, you have the soluble reactive phosphorus in milligrams per liter. On the x-axis, you have the total phosphorus in milligrams per liter. So basically, this shows you the ratio of the distribution between the SRP and the total phosphorus fractions. So the blue data points here is approximately 20,000 data points from water sources, surface water sources, which was procured from the water quality portal sponsored by the USGS. So as you can see in the distribution of these blue data points for the environmental water, that it spreads all over. So you have water which has 100% of the composition is in the soluble reactive form. However, you also have scenarios where around 30% of the data points, you can see that more than 50% were in the soluble reactive form. However, that also means that the rest 50% is not in the non-reactive form or could be in the particulate reactive form. And at the same time, in the same plot, we show comparison of the environmental water distribution with wastewater, sewage sludge, and livestock manure. And these data points were procured from independent research articles. And as you can see in the distribution, that the wastewater actually has a very high proportion of soluble reactive phosphorus from our survey, which was in a way surprising given that you have a lot of different compounds in the wastewater typically. but it seems like most of the fraction is in the readily recoverable form, which is a good news. But when it comes to livestock manure and sewage sludge, you have a much lower proportion in the soluble reactive phosphorus form. So in general, what this plot shows is that the fractions vary quite a lot, and it varies based on the type of wastewater. And at the same time, when it comes to environmental waters, we have to look at geographical and temporal locations and see what kind of fractions exist. So in the next plot, we have the same information, just depicted in a different way. On the y-axis, you have the ratio of the soluble reactive phosphorus to total phosphorus. So basically, as high we go, the better it is. That means more soluble reactive fractions exist, which can be readily removed and recovered. And lower you go, the more non-reactive fractions exist. So again, focusing on the blue data points, which represent the environmental water, you can see the distribution going from all the way to 100% to less than 10. And also one thing interesting to see here, if you look at the left side of that plot, you see a lot of these curvilinear patterns. So these were quite interesting when we first saw it, and we can't actually explain it, why these curves exist, other than the fact that on that side, if you look at the x-axis, we are in the 10 microgram per liter range in terms of phosphorus. And this is pretty much near the detection limit of most phosphorus analysis out there. So I think it's could be an issue with the methods used to detect it. But
okay, so it's just an artifact of the analysis.
Yeah, yes, that's what we think that is. But generally, again, the point to make here is that the environmental waters, the fractions of soluble, reactive, and non-reactive can vary quite a bit. And again, compare that with the wastewater. The wastewater, as it turns out, is on the higher end, again, which is a good news. But again, when we come to heavy or a low flow, high concentrated streams such as sewage sludge and livestock manure, there are more non-reactive fractions, particularly reactive fractions in the water. So generally speaking, before we move on to talk about how to get them out, we have to see what kind of water we're looking at and analyze what fractions are in there.
Okay. And then you turn your attention then in the paper to how to convert that non-reactive phosphorus to reactive phosphorus.
Yes. So going back to the flow chart, which I showed initially. So basically our whole point of this review is that we need to focus on future technologies, future processes, which can help convert these non-reactive fractions into reactive fractions. More specifically, the soluble reactive would be better, but even if it's in any particulate reactive form, it can at least be removed from the water. And that could help prevent any eutrophication, etc. So generally, all these blue fractions, which includes both soluble non-reactive and particulate non-reactive, within which you have the polyphosphates and the organic phosphate compounds, these all need to be converted back to the soluble or the particulate reactive phosphorus compounds, which can then be recovered using conventional techniques like precipitations or ion exchange, etc. So going back to that table again, where we showed different compounds or examples of them. So one thing important to note here is if you are trying to convert non-reactive to the first soluble reactive compounds, we need to break the bonds of these phosphate molecules. So one thing we need to focus on when we are trying to look at conversion of non-reactive phosphorus compounds to reactive is to what kind of bonds generally these compounds have. So if you look at the second row, where we have shown the soluble non-reactive phosphorus compound, or at least examples of them, there are two kinds of bonding, or three kinds of bonding mainly seen. One is the POP bonding, which is a phosphoanhydride bonding, which are seen in the polyphosphate compounds. And so that includes the sodium triphosphate and the sodium hexametaphosphate examples. And then you have the POC bonding, or the phosphoester bonding, which is seen in glycerol phosphate and also seen in adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. The last bond you see between the sugar molecule and the phosphate is a POC bond. But at the same time, the same ATP also has a POP bond, which is on the terminal end of the phosphate chain. And the third kind of bonding you find is in the organophosphorus pesticide compounds, which is a direct PX, or where X is an electronegative group, which could be a carbon, sulfur, nitrogen, or fluorine. So as for example, you see the phosphorus attached to a sulfur in the parathion insecticide, and the one attached to nitrogen in the glyphosate herbicide. So all these bonds are different. They will have their own strengths and weaknesses. So there's a lot of variations. Unfortunately, there's not much work done to study these variations. One of the main work has been done is to looking at triphosphate or long chain polyphosphate hydrolysis. So that was the only information that we could find. Other than that, there's not much information out there. So what we try to do is to look at all the general processes which are generally used for recovering phosphorus from water and wastewater, and try to figure out from our own reviews to see which technologies can help in converting these non-reactive to reactive phosphorus compounds.
Chemistry itself is well known, right? We know these types of covalent bonds and we know how to break them apart.
Actually, when it comes to hydrolysis, yes. So there's been a lot of work done in looking at polyphosphate hydrolysis. However, when it comes to oxidation, most of the work has been done on looking at removing pesticides from water. So specifically organophosphorus pesticides using advanced oxidation process, etc. However, those studies are mainly focused on looking at the disinfection byproducts or whether that pesticide is being oxidized. But not many papers have looked at the phosphorus end products, by which I mean, did you get more orthophosphate or not?
Okay, so what did you find?
So basically for our review, we surveyed biological, physical, thermal, and chemical treatment processes, which has potential for converting the non-reactive phosphorus fractions in the recoverable fractions. So as listed here in the table, we looked at various different processes within these categories. So in generally, based on all the available literature, all four categories of treatment processes are really effective in converting the non-reactive fraction in a high-strength wastewater, such as agricultural wastewater or sludge. However, when it comes to conversion of soluble non-reactive phosphorus fractions, we believe that the chemical treatment processes such as acid-alkali treatment or advanced oxidation processes would be more effective. There hasn't been much studies done in actually looking at the conversion processes for soluble non-reactive phosphorus fractions. However, based on the studies done on looking at removal of organophosphorus pesticides, we believe that the chemical treatment processes would be more effective. However, there's also a drawback. The chemical treatment processes will also have a higher material inputs and also energy inputs. So that's why everyone, based on our survey, we have to look at different wastewaters and do a cost-benefit analysis to see if it's worthwhile and which treatment process would be better. If you have a lot of particulate non-reactive phosphorus, then you can go with any of the physical, thermal, and biological treatment processes. But when it comes to soluble, right now we don't have any cost-effective method of doing the conversion. In summary, what we would like to emphasize to our readers is that the non-reactive phosphorus fractions can be a substantial portion of the total phosphorus load in any given wastewater. And again, in order to ensure sufficient sustainable phosphorus management, it is important that researchers and operators look at the non-reactive phosphorus fraction seriously. Now, in terms of removing and also recovering this valuable fraction of phosphorus, we have to develop physical, chemical, or biological treatment processes in order to convert it into a recoverable fraction. Currently, based on our survey, we haven't found any treatment systems which are available. They're all under development. And again, based on our survey, each water and wastewater could vary based in their proportions, and hence a cost-benefit analysis and a proper survey needs to be conducted as well. So.
Okay, great. So thanks a lot for that, Kaushik. That was very interesting. I'm guessing that's your next area of research then, is looking at cost-benefit analysis of these technologies?
Yes. So right now, in order to look at the cost benefit analysis, we need to have some data. Right now, there hasn't been much work done in looking at the conversion of the soluble non-reactive phosphorus fractions. And also in environmental waters, such as high flow dilute waters. So that's where the data is lacking. So one of the things we are trying to do is to initiate work in that research field. So we are conducting advanced oxidation process treatment and looking at how the dissolved non-reactive organic phosphorus fractions are converted to reactive phosphorus fractions.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Kaushik, for joining us for Phosphorus Science Now. It was a pleasure speaking with you.
Oh, it was an honor, and thank you for inviting me.